The desert wind howled its mournful song, a symphony of fine, stinging sand against parched skin. Sergeant Maxwell's breath itched, each gasp a gritty struggle against the dust that coated his throat. His gaze swept across the makeshift trench, a shallow scar in the earth offering scant protection. Around him, the faces of his men were etched with a blend of exhaustion and stark, primal fear. The relentless barrage of enemy fire had pinned them down for hours, the sun a malevolent eye in the endless sky, beating a cruel rhythm on their helmets. Hope, a fragile thing at the best of times in this forsaken theater of war, was now a distant, forgotten memory. No reinforcements were coming. No air support. Just the ever-present, suffocating dust and the terrifying whistle of incoming shells. Death, cold and inevitable, felt less like a threat and more like a patient, silent observer, watching their final minutes tick away. They were caught, utterly and hopelessly, in a trap of steel and sand, with no conventional escape route visible. Survival seemed an impossibility, yet somewhere, deep within the annals of military history, an answer lay buried, waiting for a mind unconventional enough to unearth it. Far from the searing sands and the thunder of artillery, in a quiet training camp nestled amidst rolling English hills in 1942, stood Sergeant Elias Vance. He was an anomaly, a man who moved with the quiet intensity of a scholar rather than the blustering authority of a drill instructor. His uniform, though regulation, always seemed to carry the faint, comforting scent of aged paper and leather, a stark contrast to the sweat and cordite that usually defined a soldier's aroma. Vance wasn't known for barking orders or pushing men until they broke. Instead, his reputation stemmed from his eccentric methods, his peculiar insights, and an almost obsessive intellectual curiosity that seemed utterly out of place in the grim enterprise of war. He possessed eyes that saw beyond the surface, a mind that appreciated the subtle interplay of strategy and psychology, often referencing obscure historical battles or philosophical texts during drills, much to the bewilderment and occasional amusement of his colleagues. He believed that the mind, just as much as the body, needed rigorous training and unconventional thought to truly conquer fear and defeat an enemy. The world outside their quiet camp was aflame. World War II raged with a terrifying ferocity, consuming lives and nations in its insatiable maw. Every newspaper headline screamed of new fronts, new horrors, and the ever-present threat of impending darkness. The stakes were inconceivably high, not just for nations, but for every individual soldier, every family, every human soul caught in the conflagration. The demand for well-trained soldiers was insatiable, and the pressure on training camps like theirs was immense. Yet Vance understood that it wasn't just about turning civilians into fighting machines. It was about preparing them for an entirely new kind of warfare, one that often defied conventional logic and demanded an adaptability rarely found in standard military protocols. He saw the war not merely as a clash of armies, but as a profound test of human resilience, ingenuity, and spirit. A new batch of recruits arrived, fresh-faced and wide-eyed, yet already carrying the invisible weight of the war. They were a motley crew, plucked from farms, factories, and universities, their bodies often soft, their minds filled with a mixture of naive patriotism and simmering dread. They fumbled with their rifles, stumbled through drills, and their morale, even before facing a single enemy combatant, seemed fragile, prone to splintering under the slightest pressure. Vance observed them with a quiet intensity, his gaze analytical, seeing past their physical shortcomings to the deeper psychological battles they were already fighting. He knew that brute force training alone would not forge them into the soldiers they needed to be. This was not a war that could be won by muscle alone. It required cunning, critical thinking, and the ability to find solutions where none seemed to exist. He recognized that their greatest enemy might not be the opposing army, but their own fear and lack of mental preparedness. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community for more untold stories of courage and ingenuity. Vance's approach to training differed radically from his peers. While other instructors barked orders and pushed recruits through grueling physical regimens, Vance focused on cultivating mental fortitude, problem-solving skills, and critical thinking. His morning sessions often involved intricate navigation exercises without maps, relying solely on observation and deduction, or theoretical tactical dilemmas that demanded creative solutions rather than brute force. He would set up mock skirmishes where success wasn't measured by who fired first, but by who outsmarted their opponent using the least resources. His lessons delved into the psychology of fear, the importance of maintaining an agile mind under duress, and the value of unconventional tactics gleaned from historical military campaigns. He spoke less of bayonet charges and more of Sun Tzu, less of marching formations and more of exploiting an enemy's psychological vulnerabilities. His peers, grizzled sergeants hardened by years of conventional military training, often openly mocked his academic approach, calling him Professor Vance, behind his back, their snorts of derision echoing through the barracks. They saw his methods as impractical, a waste of precious training time when real soldiers needed to learn how to fight, not philosophize. At the core of Vance's unorthodox teaching was his constant companion, an old, worn book. Its leather binding was cracked, its pages yellowed with age, and it seemed to be perpetually dog-eared at multiple spots. He carried it everywhere, pulling it out during breaks, referencing it during lectures, and sometimes even reading passages aloud during late-night study sessions with his recruits. It wasn't a textbook on modern warfare or a field manual. Instead, it seemed to be a collection of ancient texts, philosophical treatises, and obscure historical accounts. He called it the thinking man's guide to survival. He would often quote from it during drills, using cryptic excerpts as prompts for problem-solving exercises, or conducting strange, seemingly irrelevant tasks based on its contents. For instance, he once had a squad spend an entire afternoon sketching the patterns of shadows cast by trees, explaining it was about seeing what others overlook. This habit, the constant presence of the enigmatic old book, only deepened the recruits' confusion and, initially, their disdain. They were young men eager for straightforward instructions on how to survive a war, not abstract lessons from a dusty tome. The recruits and Vance's fellow officers viewed him with a mixture of suspicion and amusement. They questioned the practicality of his methods and the brutal reality of wartime. "What good is ancient philosophy when you're facing a panzer division?" one corporal once quipped, earning laughter from his squad. The recruits, though they respectfully followed orders, yearned for more conventional training. They wanted to learn how to fire their rifles faster, how to dig a foxhole deeper, how to march longer distances. They saw the old book trick as just another one of Vance's peculiar quirks, a distraction from what truly mattered. They felt Vance was detached from the urgent, brutal demands of the conflict, lost in his intellectual pursuits while the world bled. This growing skepticism and the recruits' internal grumbling often reached Vance's ears, but he remained unperturbed, his conviction unwavering. He knew what he was doing, even if no one else understood it yet. As the war intensified across multiple fronts, the need for effective, battle-ready soldiers became even more urgent. Reports from the front lines painted a grim picture. Casualty rates were soaring, and the enemy was proving to be cunning and relentless. This escalating pressure translated directly to the training camps. Superiors, feeling the heat from above, began to scrutinize Vance's unconventional methods with increasing concern. They pushed for more traditional, rote-learning drills, emphasizing physical conditioning and strict adherence to established military doctrine. There was whispered talk of transferring Vance to an administrative role, or even having him reassigned to a less crucial post, if he couldn't conform. They argued that there was no time for abstract theory, only practical, immediate skills would save lives. Vance, however, held his ground, believing that his unconventional approach was, in fact, the most practical solution to the evolving nature of warfare. He understood that true survival depended not just on brawn, but on the intellectual agility that his book fostered. His conviction, however, was about to receive its first, albeit subtle, validation. During a simulated ambush exercise designed to test their reaction under pressure, a critical miscalculation by a junior officer led the opposing enemy force to unexpectedly flank Vance's recruits. Panic began to ripple through the ranks as the situation quickly deteriorated beyond the parameters of the exercise. Recruits, trained for frontal assaults and predictable threats, froze, their standard responses proving utterly useless against the sudden, dynamic threat. It was a chaotic scene, a stark demonstration of their theoretical unpreparedness for real-world unpredictability. Vance, observing from a slight rise, didn't shout commands or intervene physically. Instead, he calmly began to issue a series of seemingly unrelated instructions, drawing directly from principles he'd lectured on from his old book, principles that focused on observation, environmental exploitation, and psychological misdirection. Jenkins, use the sun! Peterson, find the highest point, don't engage, merely observe and report the pattern of movement. Davis, create a distraction with the smoke, not where they expect it, but where it will obscure their periphery. His voice, though not loud, carried an undeniable authority, cutting through the rising confusion. Hesitantly, the recruits, conditioned to obey, started to implement these unconventional directives. Jenkins used the afternoon sun to blind a flanking unit momentarily. Peterson identified a subtle weakness in the enemy's maneuver from his vantage point, and Davis's smoke became less of a screen and more of a psychological irritant, forcing the enemy to reposition clumsily. Within minutes, what looked like a complete rout transformed into a disoriented pause for the attackers, allowing Vance's recruits to swiftly disengage and regroup to a more defensible position, turning certain defeat into an unexpected, if messy, strategic withdrawal. The exercise ended not with a clear victor, but with a palpable sense of relief among Vance's men and grudging respect from the opposing force. It was a minor incident, far from a real battlefield, but it subtly demonstrated the latent power of thinking beyond the manual. Following this small triumph, the book's influence deepened in their daily routine. Vance began to integrate more advanced concepts from its ancient pages, moving beyond basic observation to teach nuanced deduction and the art of unconventional tactics. He introduced exercises focused on identifying subtle patterns and seemingly random events, on predicting an opponent's next move not just based on their position, but on their observed psychology and habits. He challenged them to solve puzzles that required lateral thinking, to find solutions that defied conventional military logic. The enemy is not just the man with the gun, he would explain, but the terrain, the weather, their expectations, and their fears. Know them all. He pushed them to understand that warfare was as much a psychological chess match as it was a physical confrontation. He was subtly preparing them for complex scenarios, for a kind of enemy they hadn't yet encountered, an enemy whose tactics might be entirely alien to their standard training. Despite the minor success during the simulated ambush, and Vance's relentless, quiet instruction, the core group of recruits remained largely unconvinced. They acknowledged the momentary reprieve, but dismissed it as a fluke, a lucky break, or merely Vance's own cleverness rather than a repeatable methodology. They still felt unprepared for actual combat, believing Vance's methods were too theoretical, too abstract, too far removed from the raw, bloody reality of war. They longed for the reassuring simplicity of conventional drills, for tangible skills they could measure, faster reloading, more accurate shooting, stronger endurance. The abstract lessons on observation and deduction felt like intellectual parlor games when they envisioned themselves facing machine gun fire and artillery barrages. A growing frustration simmered beneath the surface. They believed Vance was not adequately equipping them for the fight ahead, that his wisdom was an indulgence they couldn't afford. They yearned for practical, visceral preparedness, not philosophical musings. Then, the orders arrived. Swift, unexpected, and utterly devoid of euphemism. The entire regiment, including Vance's company, was to be deployed immediately to a critical, notoriously dangerous front line, North Africa. The news hit like a physical blow, silencing the barracks and replacing the recruits' simmering frustration with a stark, chilling fear. North Africa. The name itself conjured images of scorching deserts, relentless sandstorms, and a cunning, entrenched enemy. It was a theater of war known for its harsh, unforgiving environmental conditions and the enemy's mastery of ambush tactics, their ability to disappear into the vast, featureless landscape and strike with devastating precision. There would be no time for further training, no chance to fully internalize Vance's peculiar lessons. They were going straight from the theoretical to the terrifyingly real, thrust into a battleground where conventional tactics often proved fatal. The old book's wisdom felt more distant, more abstract than ever, as the grim reality of their imminent deployment loomed irrevocably. The arid expanse of North Africa swallowed them whole. The regiment, disembarking from transport ships under the merciless glare of the desert sun, was immediately confronted by a landscape utterly alien to their European sensibilities. The air, thick with dust and the smell of unfamiliar spices, crackled with an oppressive heat that seeped into their bones. The sand, a swirling, ever-present entity, seemed to defy all attempts at order, coating uniforms, jamming mechanisms, and filling every crevice. Within days, the initial skirmishes began. The enemy, cloaked in the ochre hues of the desert, struck with brutal efficiency, melting back into the shimmering distance before a cohesive response could be mounted. Traditional tactics, honed on the parade grounds and in the rolling hills of England, proved cumbersome and largely ineffective. The open terrain offered little cover, and the enemy's intimate knowledge of the wadis and dunes gave them an almost supernatural advantage. Every patrol was a gamble, every halt a potential ambush. The desert itself felt like an enemy collaborator, sapping their strength, blurring their vision, and intensifying their fear. The enemy's cunning was legendary, etched into the sand by their relentless and unpredictable attacks. They operated not in large, discernible units, but in small, agile groups, striking from unexpected angles, their movements fluid and ghost-like. Their ambush tactics were a masterclass in psychological warfare, sudden, devastating bursts of fire from unseen positions, followed by an eerie silence, leaving the regiment disoriented and distrustful of every shadow, every rock formation. They exploited every undulation of the terrain, every mirage, turning the vast, seemingly featureless landscape into a labyrinth of death traps. Casualties mounted steadily, not just from direct engagements, but from heatstroke, exhaustion, and the insidious erosion of morale. The psychological strain on the regiment was immense. Men who had trained to face a visible, organized opponent found themselves battling an elusive phantom, their courage slowly bleeding away with each unseen bullet and each unexplained disappearance of a comrade. They felt vulnerable, exposed, and profoundly outmaneuvered. Amidst the growing chaos and despair, while others struggled to adapt, Vance remained an unmoving eye in the storm. His observations were keen, almost detached, as if he were studying a complex problem rather than participating in desperate survival. He didn't overtly challenge the conventional command structure, knowing such actions would be futile and detrimental to what remained of their unity. Instead, he observed, meticulously noting the patterns of enemy movement, the subtle tells in their attacks, the environmental factors they exploited. He began to adapt the principles from his old book to this harsh new environment. His discreet sessions with his squad continued, often held under the cover of darkness, away from the prying eyes of more traditional officers. He refined their understanding of observation, teaching them to read the wind, the shifting sands, the flight of desert birds as potential indicators of enemy presence. He emphasized pattern recognition, urging them to look beyond the immediate engagement to understand the broader strategic intent behind the enemy's seemingly random attacks. He spoke of historical campaigns fought in similar arid lands, drawing parallels, offering insights that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to make sense to his men. He taught them to see the desert not as an empty expanse, but as a complex, living entity, full of hidden pathways and deceptive cover. The danger escalated with each passing day. A disastrous engagement, a poorly executed flanking maneuver that turned into a rout, left the regiment scattered and disoriented. They found themselves pushed deep behind enemy lines, isolated from their main force, their communications severed, their supply lines cut. Resources were dwindling rapidly, water was scarce, ammunition was precious, and the desert winds carried not just sand, but the chilling certainty of their predicament. Morale, already fragile, plummeted to dangerous lows. The initial fear had hardened into a cold, pervasive dread. They were a lost outpost in an unforgiving land, surrounded by an unseen but ever-present enemy, their options narrowing with each passing hour. The harsh reality of their isolation began to sink in, turning desperate thoughts into silent, agonizing prayers. The vastness of the desert, once merely challenging, now felt like an accomplice in their impending doom, its endless horizons offering no escape, only the promise of a slow, agonizing end. The vastness of the desert, once merely challenging, now felt like an accomplice in their impending doom, its endless horizons offering no escape, only the promise of a slow, agonizing end. Just as the last vestiges of hope threatened to evaporate, a deafening explosion ripped through the pre-dawn silence, echoing off the ancient canyon walls. Dust and rock fragments rained down, followed by a torrent of concentrated machine gun fire from above and on all sides. They were caught. Ambushed. The enemy had waited patiently, herding them into this desolate, rock-strewn canyon, a natural funnel with sheer, impassable cliffs on either side. It was a perfectly executed trap, sprung with brutal precision. The sporadic engagements of the past days had been mere preliminary skirmishes, designed to wear them down, to push them exactly into this inescapable maw. Desperation clawed at the men. Panic, a cold, insidious beast, began to spread through the ranks like wildfire. Sergeant Maxwell, usually a pillar of stoicism, felt a tremor of pure terror run through him as he surveyed their predicament. They were truly surrounded, pinned down by an unrelenting barrage that seemed to come from every shadow, every crevice in the unforgiving rock face. The screams of the wounded mingled with the incessant rattle of gunfire, creating a discordant symphony of impending annihilation. Communications, already spotty, were now utterly severed, their radios silenced by the chaos or perhaps deliberately jammed. Escape, through any conventional means, was not merely improbable. It was an absolute impossibility. Faces contorted with fear and despair, eyes wide with the stark knowledge that this was likely the end. The battle for survival had shifted from skirmish to siege, and they were the helpless quarry. Each passing second seemed to stretch into an eternity of encroaching dread. Amidst the hail of bullets and the chilling reports of mounting casualties, a few advances earlier, seemingly abstract lessons began to resurface in the minds of his most receptive recruits. Jenkins, huddled behind a meager rock outcrop, remembered Vance's insistence on observing the rhythm of an attack, not just the noise. Peterson, clutching his rifle, recalled the sergeant's uncanny ability to spot patterns in chaos, to look beyond the immediate threat. Davis, whose hands trembled as he reloaded, vaguely recalled a lecture about using the enemy's expected reactions against them. These were not fully formed thoughts, but fleeting impressions, fragments of wisdom that had once seemed irrelevant, now glimmering faintly in the suffocating darkness of their despair. The abstract suddenly felt terrifyingly pertinent, even if they couldn't yet grasp its full application. These nascent thoughts were anchors in a sea of pure, unadulterated fear. Traditional leadership, caught completely off guard, was either incapacitated or overwhelmed, barking fragmented, ineffective orders that only added to the confusion. Officers, trained for frontal assaults and orderly retreats, found their doctrines utterly useless in this crushing, suffocating encirclement. It was in this vacuum of decisive command, this critical juncture between panic and surrender, that Vance emerged. His movements were calm, deliberate, a stark contrast to the frantic energy surrounding him. He didn't shout, didn't posture. Instead, his eyes, sharp and analytical, swept across the brutal tableau, taking in the enemy positions, the limited cover, the desperate faces of his men, and the unyielding canyon walls. He moved with the quiet certainty of a man observing a complex puzzle, rather than facing imminent death. He knelt beside a wounded private, offering a word of quiet reassurance before moving to a vantage point that offered a slightly broader view of their entrapment. The incessant gunfire seemed to wash over him, leaving him untouched. From his worn haversack, he carefully, almost reverently, produced his old, leather-bound book. His fingers, stained with desert dust, traced the ancient script on a page, his lips moving silently as if consulting a revered oracle. He wasn't simply reading, he was seeking confirmation, searching for principles that transcended time and circumstance, wisdom distilled over millennia of conflict. The book, once a symbol of his eccentricity, now became a beacon of quiet purpose in the heart of their certain doom. He was not just consulting a mere text, he was drawing upon a deep well of strategic thought, looking for the threads of a solution woven into the wisdom of ages. The enemy might have pinned them down physically, but Vance was about to unleash a weapon they could never anticipate: the power of an ancient, unyielding intellect. His methodical assessment, grounded in the timeless lessons of his book, was the first flicker of resistance against the enveloping darkness. His methodical assessment, grounded in the timeless lessons of his book, was the first flicker of resistance against the enveloping darkness. Vance's fingers, having lingered on a particular diagram of ancient Roman siege tactics and then a passage on Sun Tzu's principles of deception, now moved with renewed purpose. He recognized the enemy's pattern, a predictable ruthlessness that mirrored historical sieges, albeit with modern weaponry. They were pressing their advantage, seeking to break morale through relentless, focused fire, expecting the trapped soldiers to crack under pressure and attempt a futile frontal breakout. But Vance, guided by the wisdom gleaned from countless battles fought across millennia, saw not an inescapable trap, but a carefully constructed, yet inherently flawed, psychological box. He identified a subtle, almost invisible, weakness in their encirclement, a slightly elevated, jagged ridge on the far side of the canyon that the enemy considered impassable, a natural barrier they deemed sufficient. It was a perilous route, requiring climbing and an intimate knowledge of the canyon's deceptive acoustics, but it was there, overlooked by an enemy too confident in their numerical and positional superiority. With a calmness that belied the roaring chaos around them, Vance began to move among the pinned-down men, his voice low but firm, cutting through the din. He gathered the remaining officers and his most trusted squad members, their faces grim and dust-streaked. "We are not breaking out," he stated, his eyes locking with each man. "We are escaping. And we will do so through their blind spot, using their own tactics against them." He unrolled a crude map, sketched days earlier during one of his solitary observations, pinpointing the treacherous ridge, a narrow, winding ascent that few would consider viable. His plan was audacious, a calculated gamble that combined ancient military strategy with a deep understanding of human psychology, both their own and the enemy's. It involved a complex series of diversions, a feigned counterattack on their weakest flank, not to engage, but to draw enemy fire and attention. Simultaneously, small teams would use improvised smoke grenades to create a dense, localized screen, obscuring their movements. Crucially, a small detachment, led by Vance himself, would scale the impassable ridge, using the noise of the diversion and the cover of the smoke to mask their ascent. Once atop the ridge, they would exploit the canyon's natural acoustics to amplify shouts and create the illusion of a larger force, further confusing the enemy. The ultimate goal was not to fight their way out, but to vanish, to melt into the desert as if swallowed by the very sands that had trapped them. Initial skepticism rippled through the small group. Sergeant Maxwell, though he respected Vance, openly questioned the feasibility. "Sir, that ridge is a death trap. And a feint? They'll just redouble their efforts." Other recruits muttered, their eyes darting between Vance and the hostile cliffs. The plan flew in the face of everything they had been taught about direct engagement and securing positions. It was too risky, too unorthodox, too reliant on timing and luck. The idea of climbing an exposed ridge under fire, while simultaneously creating loud diversions, seemed like an elaborate suicide pact. The sheer audacity of it, coupled with their desperate circumstances, made it almost unfathomable. They were soldiers trained to fight, not to perform a theatrical escape. Vance's unwavering conviction, however, combined with the undeniable reality of their dire situation, certain annihilation if they remained, slowly chipped away at their reluctance. They had no other options. As Vance calmly elaborated, detailing each intricate step, the logic behind his trick began to emerge, piercing through the fog of their despair. He explained how the enemy, confident in their trap, would be psychologically predisposed to react to a frontal assault, neglecting their supposed impregnable flanks. He spoke of the fog of war, and how confusion, once sown, could be exploited. The smoke wasn't just for cover, it was a psychological weapon, creating uncertainty. The shouts from the ridge wouldn't just be noise. They would be a carefully crafted illusion of a reinforcing, flanking force, designed to make the enemy overreact and reallocate resources away from their true escape path. He drew parallels to ancient battles where smaller forces had outmaneuvered larger armies through sheer ingenuity and deception. Slowly, a glimmer of hope, initially fragile and tentative, began to ignite in the eyes of the trapped men. This wasn't just a desperate scramble. It was a strategically sound, if terrifyingly bold, maneuver. This seemingly impossible plan, born from the dusty pages of an old book, might just be their only chance at survival. They understood, finally, that Vance wasn't asking them to fight smarter, but to think smarter, to become part of a larger, intricate deception. The desert air, still thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and fear, remained heavy as the grim decision was made. Vance's plan, audacious and seemingly impossible, became their sole tether to survival. The regiment, galvanized by a desperate hope and the sergeant's unwavering conviction, began its meticulous execution. The initial phase commenced with a diversionary fire, a carefully orchestrated burst of rifle and machine gun fire directed at the enemy's most heavily defended flank. It wasn't meant to cause significant damage, but to create a believable, albeit doomed, frontal assault. Sergeant Maxwell, his face grim but determined, led this crucial feint, his men laying down suppressing fire that drew immediate and furious retaliation from the entrenched enemy positions. The deafening exchange of bullets and the shouts of battle created the perfect auditory camouflage for the next crucial step. Simultaneously, small teams, previously designated by Vance, began deploying the improvised smoke grenades. These weren't the thick, military-grade screens they were accustomed to, but crude concoctions of oil-soaked rags and desert plants, ignited and strategically placed to generate plumes of dark, choking smoke. The wind, surprisingly, cooperated, carrying the thick, oily vapor across the canyon floor, obscuring their true intentions and creating a chaotic, disorienting haze. Private Jenkins, no longer a skeptic, moved with a newfound purpose, ensuring the smoke billowed effectively, his mind replaying Vance's lessons on environmental manipulation. The enemy, blinded and confused by the sudden, unexpected smoke screen, intensified their indiscriminate firing, their predictable response a testament to Vance's understanding of their psychological patterns. They fired into the smoke, wasting precious ammunition on phantoms, their focus entirely on the perceived frontal attack. Underneath this enveloping blanket of noise and smoke, Vance led his climbing team towards the impassable ridge. Each man moved with agonizing care, their hands and feet searching for purchase on the treacherous, crumbling rock face. The ascent was brutal. Loose screes shifted beneath their boots, threatening to send them tumbling into the abyss. Vance, with an almost preternatural awareness, guided them along the least stable sections, pointing out handholds invisible to the untrained eye, leveraging his intimate knowledge of the canyon's geology gleaned from hours of quiet observation. Private Peterson, a city boy completely unaccustomed to such terrain, gritted his teeth, remembering Vance's earlier training on spatial awareness and the importance of trusting one's senses over fear. He dug his fingers into a narrow crevice, pulling himself upward, the distant screams and gunfire a terrifying soundtrack to their silent struggle. There were countless near misses and heart-stopping moments. A dislodged rock clattered down the canyon wall, barely missing a climbing soldier, its echo swallowed by the ongoing firefight. A burst of enemy fire, straying from the main engagement, peppered the rock face just meters from where they climbed, sending shards of stone flying. Each man held his breath, pressing himself against the cold, unforgiving rock, the thin line between life and death a tangible presence. Discipline, forged not by rote but by a deeper understanding of their collective purpose, kept them moving. They understood that a single mistake, a moment of panic, could unravel the entire, painstakingly crafted plan. Vance's presence, calm and focused, remained their anchor. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing, adapting, always one step ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the precarious summit of the ridge. Exhausted but exhilarated, they spread out, taking cover behind jagged rocks. Vance immediately directed them to exploit the canyon's natural acoustics. Using their cupped hands, they began to unleash a cacophony of shouts, war cries, and simulated rifle fire, echoing down into the canyon with surprising volume. The sound, amplified and distorted by the narrow walls, created the convincing illusion of a much larger flanking force descending upon the enemy. Below, the enemy's firing faltered, then shifted. Their focused assault on Maxwell's diversionary force wavered, attention drawn to this new, unexpected threat from their impenetrable flank. Confusion spread through their ranks, their predictable tactics now undermined by an opponent who refused to play by their rules. It was the breakthrough. The enemy, thrown off balance, began to reallocate resources, diverting men and machine guns to counter the phantom threat on the ridge. This created a momentary, but crucial, window of opportunity on the canyon floor. Maxwell, sensing the shift, pulled his men back from their feigned attack, melting away into the receding smoke. The entire regiment, now unified in their purpose, began to move with a renewed sense of urgency, utilizing the disarray of the enemy and the lingering smoke to navigate through a narrow, previously overlooked fissure in the canyon wall that Vance had identified. They weren't fighting their way out. They were slipping away, like ghosts in the desert wind, guided by ancient wisdom and modern ingenuity. Against all odds, with minimal casualties, the regiment had effectively evaded complete encirclement, leaving behind a bewildered and outmaneuvered enemy. The silence of their escape was punctuated only by the distant, confused shouts of their former captors, a testament to the success of Vance's quiet revolution. The silence of their escape was punctuated only by the distant, confused shouts of their former captors, a testament to the success of Vance's quiet revolution. Days later, under the cover of a moonless night, the remnants of the regiment, battered but unbroken, stumbled back into friendly lines. Their faces, etched with exhaustion and relief, told a story that words could barely contain. They had survived. Not through overwhelming firepower or conventional heroics, but through an act of audacious intelligence that defied every expectation. News of their impossible escape spread like wildfire through the ranks, quickly becoming a legend whispered around campfires, passed from one weary soldier to another. The old book trick was no longer a subject of ridicule. It was hailed as a stroke of strategic genius, a testament to the power of unconventional thinking in the face of certain doom. The aftermath was a whirlwind of debriefings, medical attention, and the slow, arduous process of coming to terms with their ordeal. The surviving soldiers, once the most vocal skeptics of Vance's methods, now looked at him with a profound, almost reverent, respect. Sergeant Maxwell, whose initial reluctance had faded into awe during the escape, personally ensured that Vance received every commendation due. He stood before the regimental commander, recounting the harrowing details, emphasizing how Vance's foresight, his uncanny ability to read the terrain and the enemy's mind, had turned certain annihilation into a miraculous survival. The old book, once a curiosity, now became a symbol of intelligent warfare, a tangible representation of wisdom that transcended the battlefield. Its worn leather cover and yellowed pages held not just words, but the very keys to their improbable salvation. The true meaning of courage, they realized, wasn't just about facing down a direct threat with a rifle, but about maintaining clarity of thought when all seemed lost, about daring to think beyond the immediate, beyond the conventional. It was about the ingenuity to find a path where none appeared to exist, to use one's intellect as powerfully as a weapon. Vance, ever humble, deflected the praise, crediting the ancient wisdom contained within his book. "I merely interpreted," he would say. "The answers were already there, written centuries ago. They only needed to be seen." His triumph was not one of personal glory, but of validating a philosophy, proving that the mind, when honed and directed, could overcome even the most formidable physical obstacles. He had demonstrated that intellectual resilience was as vital as physical endurance in the grim crucible of war. The war would continue its relentless march, but for the men of that regiment, something fundamental had shifted. They returned to the fight with a new understanding, a deeper appreciation for the subtle art of strategy, and an unshakable belief in the power of a keen mind. Vance, his quiet smile ever present, continued to carry his old book, its significance now profoundly understood by all who had witnessed its power. He knew the profound impact it had, not just on that single, desperate escape, but on the future approach to warfare. The final scene finds Vance sitting alone, away from the bustling camp, gazing at the open pages of his ancient tome. A gentle breeze ruffles the leaves, and a quiet smile plays on his lips. He closes the book slowly, as if tucking away a cherished secret, a silent acknowledgement of the countless lives saved, the battles won not with sheer force, but with the timeless, enduring strength of human intellect and the wisdom passed down through generations. What other hidden wisdom do you think our heroes might have drawn upon? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into history and human resilience, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more untold stories of courage and ingenuity. And don't forget to check out our next video, where we explore another incredible story of wartime survival.